Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll get straight into this. There will be questions and answers after this, but I'd like to welcome, thank you very much for coming today, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and Prime Minister Gordon Brown. And first, I'd like to ask the Secretary General to say a few words.
Mr. Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a great pleasure to see you. Last year, we gathered here to declare 2008 the year of the bottom billion. These are the poorest of the poor in the world who live on less than $1 a day and are vulnerable to every shock that comes. This has been a year of multiple shocks: a food crisis, a fuel crisis, now the economic crisis. Recently, we have had many devastating humanitarian disasters: earthquake, cyclones, and regional conflicts, wars. To this, we can add accelerating climate change and the growing scarcity of water and other of the Earth's critical resources. As we struggle to cope with these and many other challenges, we must not waver in our commitment to the poorest of the poor. We must stand by those who are most vulnerable. To be sure, the economic crisis reduces our resources. It threatens to deflect attention from other global problems: climate change, issues of water, and the environment and economic development. We are here today to say that this will not happen. We have made the solemn pledges under the Millennium Development Goals. In this regard, I'd like to particularly commend the visionary leadership of Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He was instrumental in bringing the United Nations summit meeting on Millennium Development Goals held September last year at the United Nations, and I appreciate your leadership. At last November's G20 summit meeting in Washington, we agreed to stand by those commitments and carry them forward at our April meeting in London. Again, as the G20 summit chair, I count on Prime Minister Gordon Brown's dynamic and wise stewardship. And world is counting on your leadership, Mr. Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, now more than ever, it is time to deliver. Wealthy countries are investing hundreds of billions of dollars in economic stimulus package. I welcome these national measures, taking stimulus packages. Now more than ever, the world's poor need your help. As Secretary General of the United Nations, I say, put something aside for your less fortunate neighbors. Do not overlook them. Let us make the Millennium Development Goals a part of those investment and spending plans. We are close to eliminating diseases such as polio and containing malaria. We have made a tremendous strides in fighting HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and securing the future of children in the poorest countries. Now, more than ever, is the time to redouble our efforts. Amid hard times, let us look beyond our immediate self-interest. In our globalized world, the well-being of our neighbors is our well-being. We must stand together. Prime Minister Brown, who will speak after me, will tell you how the numbers of the world's poor are growing. We need to stand in solidarity to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. We need new partnerships, partnerships for development, for growth, for global health. This is why I have come to Davos. I have spoken with leaders from government, business communities, and civil society about the values and principles of the Global Compact. I have spoken about the importance of tackling climate change, a truly existential threat to our planet. I have talked about what I call the Global Green New Deal. Many more people now understand that scaling up a green, low-carbon economy is the best investment we can make. It can help solve the economic crisis. It will create jobs and spur growth. It is a critical step toward a sustainable future for rich nations as well as poor. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, my message is simple and clear. Now more than ever, we need to keep our focus on the big picture, the big challenges. Climate change, poverty, hunger, and economic recovery are the most important challenges for the G8, for the G20, for the United Nations, the whole international community. They are inextricably linked. They must be dealt with as one. And thank you very much for your attention.
Secretary General, thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask the Prime Minister to say a few words.
Let me say, first of all, I'm privileged to be present here with Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. I want to applaud him for the work he has done, even just over the last year, in the pursuit of the Millennium Development Goals, in trying to bring peace in Gaza, in working for reconciliation in Burma, in what he has done in the Congo and what he has attempted to do in Sudan and Darfur. And I want to thank him for his leadership on climate change, which I believe will show fruits when we reach Copenhagen. And you are admired and respected, not just in this continent, but in every continent of the world. For both of us, our first priority is the thousands, indeed millions of people in all countries in the world who are now worried about their jobs, insecure about their livelihoods, worried about their businesses and their homes. In these unprecedented times, I've come here to Davos to say that politicians and business leaders, all of us, have an urgent responsibility to rise to the challenges of leadership. 2008 will be remembered as the year when global financial markets failed. I want 2009 to be remembered as the year where the world came together to reach urgent solutions and built for the future. And I believe that history is not destiny. We have a choice about what happens next. And this is a time for more than just analysis and retrospection. It is a time for action, and it is a time for having the confidence to act. And this is a time not just for individual national measures to deal with a global financial crisis. This is the time, facing a global crisis, for the world to come together as one, out of our mutual interests and out of our dependence on each other, a shared resolution in common action to deal with real problems. And if we are to end the vicious cycle of bank failure and loss of lending capacity and loss of consumer confidence, with the impact on jobs and businesses and mortgages that we are all seeing in every continent of the world, there are, in my view, three priorities that guide us and must be adopted immediately. Stage one for our recovery has been to prevent the collapse of banking by protecting the savers throughout the world. We, Britain, injected 37 billion. Now the whole of the world has injected equity of $900 billion over the last few months. And in total guarantees to the flow of money through the banking system, they're around $7 trillion. Stage two of our recovery plan is a worldwide fiscal and monetary stimulus that has now been agreed by most countries in most continents. We are seeing the biggest fiscal stimulus the world has ever seen. And I estimate that even now that stimulus amounts to $1.5 trillion. Fiscal policy, and therefore real help to businesses and families now, is essential, because when the monetary mechanism is impaired and you have low debt and an ability to borrow at low interest rates in a low inflationary environment, this is the most obvious case for fiscal activism. But our third priority, and this is essential for the maintenance of jobs and for the recovery of businesses, is yet to be put in place in all countries. And this is the resumption of lending to the real... I'm afraid that's my phone. I'm not telling you. Stage three is essential for jobs, households and businesses. And this is yet to be put in place in many countries. This is the resumption of lending to the real economy, and it's global, where we need action. Let us remember that we're witnessing the withdrawal of lending capacity in almost every country, persistent, in every country of the world. This financial mercantilism, which is foreign banks retreating to their home base, will, if we do nothing, lead to a new form of protectionism, indeed a global deglobalization that would lead to a reduction in trade and cross-border business activity, and which would be followed quickly by the old trade protectionism of the past. The International Institute of Finance estimated yesterday that net lending into the emerging market countries of the world, which was almost $1,000 billion 2 years ago, will be little more than $150 billion next year. That is the scale of the loss of capacity. And the thing we know about protectionism is in the end it protects nobody, least of all the poor. And this withdrawal of capacity is a breach of promise of global prosperity. Now, this withdrawal of capacity threatens to make the recession longer, deeper, and more widespread. So in developed economies, the answer is clear. Make sure lending is available to small, medium, and large businesses and to households, measures we have introduced in the last few weeks. Where possible, the central bank should provide additional support, if necessary, directly to borrowers. To deal with confidence in the banking system, we need to have an insurance-based model or a good, bad, bank bad model based on the principle, in each case, of identifying and isolating bad assets and future losses. And I expect countries to announce in the next few days that they will move forward these proposals. If we are to help, as we must, developing countries and emerging markets who are being deprived of banking support and financial investment, the international institutions must, as the Secretary-General has suggested, be more proactive immediately, providing capital to keep banks from collapsing in emerging markets and developing countries, providing support to encouraging lending in their economies, understanding that fiscal and monetary policy has to support recovery, and if there is no fiscal action, that will impede recovery. But I believe also that this recovery of lending, the third stage of rebuilding the financial system, needs to be underpinned by a clear reform of the banking system. The Latin word for credit is the same as the Latin word for belief, in other words, trust. And it is trust that we have to rebuild as a result of the credit crisis and the failings of the banking system. We have a global financial system, but until now, no global coordination of supervision, only national supervisors. We have companies that live their lives internationally, but when they need a lifeline, the only lifeline is national. We have to ensure, therefore, that 4 major changes are agreed for our financial system as a matter of urgency over the next few weeks, and I look forward to agreement on them at the G20 summit in April. We need an early warning system to prevent crises, an early warning system of risks in any continent in the world economy. We need to replace the patchwork of current regulation by clear responsibilities and the accountability of not just banks, but non-banking financial institutions across the board, such as hedge funds and all complex new markets and products. We need to agree international standards of transparency and disclosure, and we need to reform and strengthen the international institutions, giving them power and resources to invest at a global level. We have a choice. Not to make a decision is itself a decision, and it would be the wrong one. Not to make a decision, the policy of doing nothing, will allow this crisis to start a retreat from globalization with huge implications for prosperity in every part of the world in the years to come. For those of us who believe in open, flexible, free trade and fair trade globalization, but a globalization that is also inclusive for the poor and sustainable for the planet, we have to take these necessary actions immediately. It would be short-sighted at this time to renege on promises we have made to the poor and to renege on our climate change commitments to future generations. Action on poverty and climate change are themselves a means by which we can advance the recovery of the world economy. So today I'm not making an abstract plea for a new internationalism. What I'm saying is, it is my belief that in this world of global dependence, the world will only work best in the future when the world works together. And all the measures I propose are about an international agreement about how we can move through the greatest financial crisis of this new global age.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. We will take many questions. Can you wait for the microphone, because you need to say who you are, where you're from, and then pose your question. And I will be very strict about keeping this to the subject of the press conference. I want no national questions. So, yes, here at the start.
Prime Minister, Daisy McAndrew from ITV News. You've been talking about rebuilding trust in politicians and in financiers. You've been talking about what you think the world should do to restore that trust and also to sort out the global economy. But many people have lost trust in your ability to run an economy. You said that the UK was best placed to weather the credit crisis. In fact, that's not true at all. The IMF said yesterday we are worse placed to weather the storm. How do you square those two? You expect people to listen to what you're doing, to follow your orders, when many people have lost belief in your abilities because of the IMF report?
We're going to take the action that is necessary. I look at what's happened over the last year. America was first into recession. The euro area was second into recession. And a few months behind, Britain has been forced into recession. But I look at the actions that we have got to take to sort this problem out. And I become convinced that the actions that we are taking, and we should have confidence in them, are recapitalising the banking system, getting cash and real help to people and businesses now, and then getting the extension of lending that is necessary for the economy to flourish. And these are the stages of building the better recovery that we need. The fact that other countries are now moving in the same direction is the right thing to do, because we need that to happen internationally. Of course we have been better placed than before. First of all, because we have low debt. Secondly, because we've got low inflation. Thirdly, because we've got low interest rates. Fourthly, because we've got low corporate debt. Fifthly, because we are making the right decisions about the future. And to those people who say,
yeah, excuse me, this is a press conference.
I'm sorry,
not an
you
argument.
can try to throw questions in this way if you want. The truth is, as I think was said this morning by the Nobel Prize winner on economics, our debt is one of the lower debts of the major countries. Please remember, when you put these questions, that America has higher debt, that France has higher debt, Germany has higher debt, Italy has higher debt, Japan has higher debt. Now, I don't want to go around and list all sorts of countries for the sake of it, but please put what's happening in an international perspective. We have lower debt than most countries, and that's why the action that we've taken, as the Nobel Prize winner for economics this morning has said, is the right action to take.
Being British, I'm very interested in British discussions, but can we try to keep this international? BBC, please.
Tanya Beckett, BBC News. You've mentioned the necessity for an early warning system, and you've moved on to talk about global regulation, which seems something that people are agreed on. However, there was an early warning system there. We have the IMF, which warned about housing markets in 2003. There were plenty of eminent economists who pointed to a number of bubbles, of which the housing market was one. They talked about American finances. The warnings were there. Either the will or the mechanism was absent to do something about it and to act.
I mean, it is true that we've been proposing for the last 10 years that we have a global financial system with proper supervision and proper accountability, and with that early warning system. There is no official early warning system for the world economy. There has been no agreement that you have this regular contact and dialogue between the supervisors and regulators that is the way that you would be able to identify all the risks. And I just have to say to you that the latest American reports that were done before the initial subprime mortgage crisis did not say that we were about to head for what actually happened at all. And there was no effective warning in the American system either about how the mechanisms that we had for spreading risk. The whole argument for the last 10 years has been that we have diversified risk by spreading it across the world. But nobody had understood that the mechanism for spreading risk would become the means for actually spreading contagion. So what happened in the subprime mortgage market reverberated right across the world, because half of the subprime mortgage lending, unknown to many people, had actually passed over to Europe. So that's how, if you like, a local crisis became a national crisis and then became an international crisis. I have to say the world was not prepared with an early warning system for that. We didn't have the international institutions in place that could have achieved a degree of crisis prevention, and we're ending up having to resolve this crisis after seeing trillions of dollars being risked internationally.
Mr. Prime Minister, Saki Ouchi of Yomiuri Shimbun from Japan. Do you plan to focus on the financial crisis at the London G20 summit, or do you plan to expand the occasion to some other issues like climate change and shortage of food, the issues that the Secretary General has just mentioned?
There will certainly be a discussion of the issues that you mentioned: climate change, poverty, the lack of provision for food aid and for dealing with famine, because it is absolutely central to a recovery of the world economy that we make advances in new environmental technologies and jobs. We deal therefore with many of the climate change problems, and at the same time we release people from the poverty that they're facing. So the world cannot fully recover unless we have a picture of a greener future, and also a future where people can look for prosperity instead of poverty. And when some people say, for example, that you've got to cut development aid at this time because you can't afford to do this, and say that we've got to abandon our climate change plans because of the economic downturn, I just say we will not solve the problem of climate change without the development of Africa. And it's absolutely crucial to the future of the world that we recognise we've got to act on climate change and act on poverty at the same time. The primary focus of the G20 summit will be on the economic recovery. It will be about jobs and growth and the financial restructuring that is necessary.
Larry Elliott, and then I would really like to have a question to the Secretary General. So, if someone would like to ask after Larry,
No problem. I know why the Prime Minister is so popular.
Okay, carry on, Larry, and then Joey.
Well, this is one for
It's
both.
going to be the focus of attention.
Yeah.
This is one for both of you then. Larry Elliott of The Guardian. The Secretary General talked about not taking our eye off of poor countries and poor people. But to an extent, hasn't that already happened? Hasn't there been a sort of crowding out of development issues over the last year as the rich countries have concentrated on their own problems? And hasn't that now been manifested in a capital shortage for emerging markets as rich countries concentrate a smaller stock of capital on their own domestic constituencies? And when that's the bit for the Secretary General. The bit for the Prime Minister is that he talks about filling the gap by expanding lending by the international institutions. But do they actually have the capacity to lend the sort of money that you're talking about? If it's going to collapse from a trillion to 150 billion, the IMF doesn't have nearly enough money to fill that gap. So where is it going to come from?
As Secretary General of the United Nations, what I can say, and I've been urging all the times since the beginning of this financial crisis, that I would strongly urge and welcome the national stimulus packages that industrialize countries to overcome this financial crisis. That is important, most urgent, in fact, because this financial crisis has been impacting all spectrums of our life, all major goals and objectives of the United Nations. We need to have capacity of those countries who can really contribute generously to all these major goals, MDGs and global public health, climate change and food security. Now what I really urge is that try to not to lose sight of the challenges of the poorest of the poor, most vulnerable people. Just set aside a certain portion of those investment. Now then, the another way of making this win-win solution is that while you carry on this stimulus packages, try to invest into a green economy. That's the way which you can catch two birds with one stone. This crisis can be turned into an opportunity. This opportunity can be seen in green growth. We have seen many success stories in terms of companies, in terms of countries. These success stories should be followed on while industrialized countries address this global financial crisis. As a Secretary General, I'm here to stress and stress more and more the challenges of most vulnerable people. That's what I'm going to speak in London in April.
Well, you know, all of us are affected if trade falls, if there is financial protectionism, and if a form of mercantilism starts to spread around the world. And what Larry has identified in his question is the withdrawal of lending from poorer countries and emerging market countries. I gave the figure of $1 trillion to $1 trillion to 150 billion, so a huge reduction in net lending to emerging markets over these years. And basically what's happening is that foreign banks are retreating from these countries, they're returning to their home base. The work of non-bank institutions in providing loans and support for the development of infrastructure and everything else in the emerging market countries has been drying up. This cannot be solved in these countries alone, so it's got to be solved internationally. It cannot be solved by one country like us taking action. It's got to be solved by all countries coming together to take action. If we don't take action on this, then obviously this will affect the rest of the world, our ability to trade, every country's ability to trade with each other. And that's why, as Larry has said in his question, I'm suggesting that the international institutions have a role to play. The International Monetary Fund should be in a position to prevent a crisis in an emerging market country, such as in Eastern Europe, by being able to act early so that the banks do not collapse. Equally, at the same time, the World Bank should be able to give support to the financial system in the poorer countries, as it has done in many instances, but in my view is in a position, and I've talked to Robert Zoellick, the President of the World Bank, about doing more. So it is possible that the international institutions can do far more. The World Bank, the regional development banks, the International Monetary Fund. It is also possible, and we are looking at other ways by which we can help developing countries and emerging countries. But I just want to mention to this audience that if we cannot do this, it will affect all of us, because it will affect our ability to trade with these countries as well as their ability to grow. And this form of deglobalization which is happening, which will lead also to trade protectionism if it's not stopped, is something I'm warning people about, but with proposals, detailed proposals that will come to the G20 to take action on this very problem. It just emphasizes, and this is in a sense what the debate is about in every country, that this is not a national economic crisis in one country. It's a global financial crisis that is spread into there being a global economic crisis. And I think people have got to recognise that we need global coordinated action to deal with it.
Question here, and then we're going to move over to this side. So yes, Joe.
Thank you, Joey Jones from Sky News. Prime Minister, could I ask you, would you agree that one of the other big dangers from the pressures that you've identified, pressures on jobs, pressures on livelihoods, is the potential for a wave of global industrial action? We've seen what's happened in France this week. We now have a sudden spate of flash strikes in the UK from workers who object to the employment of foreign workers. I mean, would you, presumably, you must have some sympathy with them, given what you've said in the past about British jobs for British workers, and globally, would you agree that this could be a taste of things to come?
I think when people see countries prepared to take direct action on unemployment, they will see that we're doing everything we can. Now, I came into politics to help people out of unemployment and to help people who were poor, and to build an economy that was sufficiently strong to weather these storms. I believe that the action we've taken to help people in work, to stay in work, to help people who lose their jobs to get jobs quickly, to help young people to continue to get the skills, so we're continuing and expanding the apprenticeship program, is the way to deal with this. I understand people's worries about the jobs, and I understand people's anxieties about employment across the country. But we are doing everything we can, both to get the economic growth moving in our country, and of course to help people who are unemployed and to help them into new jobs. And if I may just add this, the work that we do in Britain will be magnified if other countries can do similar things to what we're doing. So that's why I'm here in Davos, and that's why I'm talking to other leaders. If all countries were able to take the fiscal action that is necessary, then the effect and impact on one country of this common action would be magnified, perhaps have twice the effect. And that's why it's important there is international action as well.
I'm getting a wind-up sign, so we have two very quick questions. One there, and then Clovis Rossi, I'm afraid, and then we'll have to call it a day. I do apologise to everybody.
Shabtai Gold with DPA. Well, this is a question for both of you, actually. You mentioned about the poorest of the poor and the threat of deglobalization, but has globalization really worked for the poor? And now that we are in an economic crisis and the economy is reshaping, how do you picture globalization reshaping so that more people become part of the global economy?
In 30 seconds.
In fact, globalization has lifted many poor, many people from out of this poverty, but still not enough. We have seen many good benefits, but again, some problems are coming from this globalization. That is why we need to have, as Prime Minister just mentioned, it's very important to have internationally coordinated measures when we address a global financial crisis. And without international cooperation, you may not be able to address all these multiple crises. This is why United Nations can play an important role in coordinating together with the many member states. And I really count on Prime Minister as a chair of G20 summit meeting and as important world leader.
I am confident about our ability as a world to deal with these problems. These are problems that arise from the fact that there is globalization, but there is no solution to these problems in abandoning globalization or global contact between countries. The real issue is, do we manage globalization well or do we manage it badly? We know that there are big changes that are going to be made in the way we manage globalization, but these are the changes that will start to restore prosperity to different continents of the world. And I repeat that the 3 stages of doing so are to get the banks in a position where they do not collapse, to put ourselves in a position where we're giving real help to families and businesses in every continent, and to get the resumption of lending, which is absolutely vital, of course, for an economy to work. And we need to do that at an international as well as national level.
Clovis Hadley, a very quick question and a quick answer, because I'm afraid the panel has to go.
Prime Minister, I'm Clovis Ross from Brazilian daily Folha de São Paulo. You mentioned international agreements, international supervision as the main goals of the coming G20 summit in London. But in the previous summit in Washington, the final communique states clearly that national supervision is well above, I would say, of international supervision, certainly because the previous U.S. administration was against international force.
Can I hurry you up with the question?
Okay. Do you have any sign that the new U.S. administration is changing its attitude in relation to multilateralism, international cooperation?
Yes, there is now a recognition all around the world that if you have global financial markets and global financial flows, simply national-only supervision will be inadequate. That is the basic criterion by which you judge any reforms that are necessary. We cannot continue with a situation where we have global financial markets and no forms of global financial supervision.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry about the phone.